The sort of second in the series that we put together to be able to provide some information about leading in times like this. Obviously, it's much a discussion and a reflection. So just an opportunity for us to give some perspective, but to hear from you as well. So I appreciate that you're here today and hope you find this of value. Of course, we're pleased to be able to have our esteemed Dr. Kenny Taylor with us today as our speaker to give us some perspective. For those, I think everybody many of you know Kenny, but let me just give a bit of a background. He joined the Bush School in the fall of 2017. He's an assistant professor of practice. He serves as the director of outreach and professional development within the center. And he's also the holder of the Younger Carter Endowed Professor Practitioner in Residence. And he's also faculty fellow with the Center for Health Systems and Design. Kenny earned his MBA at Bellarmine University at the Rubel School of Business, and holds a BA in sociology also from Bellarmine, PhD in leadership studies from Our Lady of the Lake down in San Antonio, and his dissertation focused on the link between leader behavior and nonprofit organization from the impact on employee satisfaction. More than 20 years of professional experience, worked with Big Brothers, Big Sisters for over 12 years, served as an independent consultant, so has been out in the field for quite some time. Brings quite a bit to our center and the work that we're doing. I'll tell you personally, I couldn't have done it without him, so I really appreciate his help. So he's helping leading up our professional development and a lot of our outreach work, and so we're thrilled to be able to have you here, Kenny, and I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll be tracking questions. Again, you guys can put questions in the chat board as necessary. Nicole and I are going to try and track those, and Kenny will as well. So with that, sir, I think it's yours.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much, and welcome everyone. Really appreciate you taking time out to be with us today. We're going to talk about leadership in crisis today. Will went through an introduction, so I don't need to get into any of that, but we'll just go ahead and be respectful of time and jump right into what we're going to talk about today. And usually the first thing that I think about when we start to talk about leadership, and the one thing that has been fairly consistent in the academic literature in relation to leadership, is that we as leaders have two primary responsibilities. And that is making sure that we develop others that we supervise, work with. And then the other is focusing on our organizational performance. And today we won't spend as much time on the developing others, although that is part of this assessment that we'll go through today. But this is really a framework for performance. And when we think about performance, we just really have to think about the day and age and what this crisis has brought upon us. So everything that we're going to talk about today, though it does have somewhat of a focus within the nonprofit and public sector, again, it really crosses boundaries in terms of how we can think about leadership. But the framework, again, that I will walk through today is based in a public administration setting. So the research that we'll cover today, the information that we'll cover today is, again, more specifically related to public management space and the nonprofit management space. Just real quick, though Dr. Brown went through some of it, I'll just go through the mission of our center, and that is supporting the vibrant nonprofit and philanthropic sector here in the state and beyond. So welcome to all of you all that are from outside the state of Texas, but we know we have many friends from the state that are with us today. And we do that through high quality research, our professional outreach, and our engaged learning. On the professional outreach side, that's what we would consider part of today. So just as a quick plug, last week, we had a session by Dr. Angela Seaworth, who's a lecturer in our department, and she covered COVID-19 finance and HR policies and management implications. Today we'll go through leadership in crisis. Next week, on the 30th, at the same time, we'll have Dr. Will Brown covering board leadership in turbulent times. And then we'll go back to Dr. Angela Seaworth on the 7th of May, where we'll go through fundraising strategies going forward in the light of this pandemic that we're operating in. Our agenda for today, we're going to define up crisis leadership, talk about the don'ts of crisis leadership. We'll walk through crisis leadership assessment dimensions, performance tasks associated with crisis leadership, and then we'll do a little summary and then go through a few implications and then have a question and answer session. But again, for any of you all visiting with us, is just to remember that today really focuses on the performance piece. And there's so many things that we can get into when we start talking about performance. All of us that operate, those of you all that are with us today that operate in a public space, in a nonprofit space, I mean, on some level, as Dr. Brown mentioned, having been a practitioner myself, I can think of those times when vital things came up at our organizations that you really had to think through. And sometimes when we get to crisis, it can literally mean our jobs are on the line. How do we perform through crisis? And mostly what we see is through that crisis, how folks view you based on that one thing alone. So today is really simply to try to go through whether it be you or how you look to those that you operate with in a shared leadership role, is how can we personally think about leadership and what are those things that we should be conscious of as we're leading in a time like this. And so hopefully today's session will provide some framework for that. So just to get right into it, this definition of crisis leadership is really adapted from a crisis management definition, that being the sum of leader activities aimed at minimizing the impact of a crisis. And so as we've all seen, we have folks out there trying to save lives, protecting and solidifying our organization's infrastructure. And when I mentioned a little earlier, just in terms of regardless of what sector we work in, regardless of for-profit or nonprofit, one way or the other, from a performance standpoint, at any type of organization, we have a responsibility to protect and solidify whatever our infrastructure is to make sure that we're available tomorrow. And then deepening trust, whether that be internal and external, is really when we get into crisis, we tend to think about how the public views us. All of the calls that you have, whether it be from media, folks that need your services, but we certainly cannot forget about internal as well. Trust is another one of those things that has been consistent in the academic literature on leadership, that if there was ever a time to build trust, we need to make sure that we can do that in times of crisis. So what not to do when we're talking about crisis leadership. And so if there's any perception of ignoring what threats are around our organizations and our shops, so we obviously don't want to do that. Making bad decisions, we're not going to spend a lot of time there. We know we have many professionals on the line, but just purely making bad decisions internally, of course, can be bad for us personally, our careers, our organization's missions. And then behaving in ways that suggest that you don't care. And for this is what I go back to that Dr. Brown mentioned, some of where I tend to focus my time on leadership, and that being leader behavior. And so here, what I do is I go back to, we know that behavior makes a difference in terms of how people perceive us, in terms of how our employees perceive us. So when crises evolve, we have the opportunity to be even more transparent. We have the opportunity to further engage folks in decision-making processes. And then taking the time out to reflect on who you are, who you need to be. Maybe this crisis has changed certain behaviors that you need to take on, roles and responsibilities that you need to watch over, expertise that you need to develop on the fly. There's several different things that we can contemplate when we reflect on what we need to do in times like this. And then proudly displaying your morals. If there was ever a time to stick our chest out as leaders, this would be the time to do so. So in terms of thinking about performance, so there's no real gauge if we think outside of what your normal performance requirements are and the roles that you all have. But what this article tries to frame up is what are those assessment dimensions that we can think about in terms of one way how we can measure performance in a time like this. And there's three things that mentioned in this article. The first is simply making things happen. Now, making things happen goes back to organizing the work that needs to be done and directing our staff maybe in a different manner that we have, say, in the past. And then implementing vital actions that minimizes whatever threats might be available or around the corner for us. Now, when we talk about things like organizing the work, directing staff, implementation of things around our organization, those are typically things that would fall more on the management level responsibilities. But during times of crisis, what we have to remember, leadership theory always talks about flexibility that leaders should have and must employ. Well, this is definitely one of those times that when we may be typically responsible for, as leaders, setting visions at organizations, being more future oriented, we do come right back to taking a part in organizing the work that needs to happen, directing staff, being part of the implementation. Again, we tend to see those more as management roles. And in crisis situations, we need to be able to be flexible and shift into being or taking part in this type of work as well. Getting the job done. So when we talk about getting the job done, have we forged any partnerships? Have we encouraged and employed innovations to become more efficient? And this one is a tricky one. We've even heard of some of these in our own backyard here in the Brazos Valley in the greater College Station and Bryan area, where we have seen organizations come together to partner where maybe we haven't seen that before. Those are things we've talked about in the past with respect to any organization's particular mission. How do we find ways to work together? But outside of a crisis environment, those partnerships many times don't work because we find ourselves as competitors when we want to go out and raise money. We find ourselves as competitors when we provide similar services. But in times of crisis, we've certainly seen the forging of partnerships have led to many accomplishments. One that I'd like to highlight, of course, is our local United Way and our community foundation having come together to raise money to support our local organizations. So when you think about the second point, just in terms of how do we employ innovation, and this is another one of those performance things that we just think about from the standpoint of if you have standards of practice at your organizations or certain standards that you operate on a daily basis, just to ask yourself the question, is that good enough for the environment that we're operating in? So how do we find workarounds that still hold up our professional standards at our organizations? What can we complement to make sure that we're doing the right things in times of crisis? Where normally we might say, we do this the same way every time to make sure that we have that consistency in our organizations. This is definitely the time when coupled with the lack of financial resources, well, we simply have to find new ways to do things. And that's, again, one of those performance assessments where when we think about how will we be judged in relation to performance, or what are things that I can think about personally in relation to performance, knowing that just even from our own data here locally, when we inquired with local organizations about how their organizations are being affected, and we know that many are concerned with the lack of financial resources that are available or financial resources that were once available but have been directed in other directions. So what do we do in that case? How do we still find workarounds to be innovative? I know for a fact that when it comes to others judging our performance, innovation is one of those things that tends to come up in the leadership literature quite a bit. And then third, on the assessment dimensions, when we think about performance, fulfilling that symbolic need for direction and guidance. And so because this was done or looked at from a public management standpoint, we tend to get caught up, or the examples that were provided is getting caught up from how the public perceives us. We want to be in the media. We want to be out there out front. So much direction is focused toward our external, but we have to remember that symbolic leadership inside, that pep in your step, how you communicate, those things that we've went through and talked about already. It's an opportunity for heightened communication, the opportunity to display leader behavior and to deepen trust. One of the things that I usually go back to is the time that I first started as the CEO of Big Brothers Big Sisters over in Austin. And during that time, I would certainly consider that a crisis. And before anything, even like a pandemic, I mean, most of us that work in a public space where we have an obligation to serve others, we feel like our work is urgent on a regular basis. But when you go through transitions of CEOs and the loss of money and layoffs, those could just as well be looked at as crisis. So what do you do internally and not forgetting about that part and not focusing so much of our attention to reestablishing relationships out in the community? Not saying that that's not important, but what we tend to see happen is that there's not enough balance between the two of focusing both internally and externally when we talk about that symbolic need for leadership. So maybe we can have a few folks chime in, but once we go through the assessment dimensions of crisis leadership, we really just have to ask ourselves one question. And did you or did those charged with crisis leadership responsibilities do everything that you could to facilitate an effective response to whatever the crisis was at hand? Not just this pandemic, but any crisis at hand. And yes, we will get into some question and answer sessions, but maybe I could take just a quick stop there and check in and see if anyone wants to respond to this question, or maybe go through an example that they have in relation to doing everything in relation to your responsibility during a time like this. Anyone feel like they'd like to respond?
Yeah, I have one question for you.
Sure.
When you talked about stepping up and doing something different during crisis, you're essentially resetting your own bar, because then if you're able to produce at that level, why would you ever go back?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, this seems so new and that it's going to last a while, and we just anticipate that it'll be a new operating environment that we'll be in. And so that innovation is important. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I've looked at in the past is trying to answer the question or reflecting on where will tomorrow's leaders in the public service space come from? And though there was a time when many researchers said, we're not sure and we'll never have enough to fulfill those voids of leadership. But on the opposite hand, we also had many researchers come back to say, nonprofits, public spaces always evolve, always find new ways to do things. So to your point, once we figure those things out, we need to build and not go back. So thank you for mentioning that. Any others?
Kenny, there is one there in the chat box asking about sort of, there's a lot of unknown in the environment. And so how does a leader, right? You talked about the importance of being, symbolic leadership of being out in front, but also the reality of, as individuals, as human beings, we're not quite sure sometimes what's going to be around the corner, potentially next month, maybe not even next week.
Right.
It's a new environment out there. Just some thoughts about that complexity of trying to balance the unknown versus trying to provide a sense of stability.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess the way that I would respond there is really two things, and one has to do with we talked about, or I'll get to it here in a later slide, but we can certainly move to it where I wanted to mention the opportunity to share that responsibility with others, and also to make sure that you're reflecting on what you believe to be the case in the future. Um, Leadership is not easy. I talk about this quite a bit, that leadership is tough. It's not an easy job. If it was, we would have many people raise their hands to step up and take on roles that are so vital, and especially in a service environment. So, generally, with that being the case, I don't think any of us can say that we have all that we need to think through that. So, the opportunity is certainly there to share some of that responsibility, to kick ideas around, rely on volunteers. Dr. Brown is going to talk about board structures and board governance. At our nonprofit organizations, I'll just go there since I'm assuming that that's mostly who we have on our conference here. If there was ever a time to engage members at a deeper level, maybe this is the opportunity that you're looking for in terms of having others that can help you think through that. And then I'll go back through the literature, which I think kind of gets, again, a little bit further down into our presentation, is, personally as a leader, with you having the role as the leader, how do you personally reflect? How much time are you actually taking time out to design what tomorrow might look like? And so if you're unsure about stability of an organization, what many leaders should be doing is designing what your organization looks like tomorrow. How would you fund a new structure? Those vital components in terms of your strategic plan. If that gets thrown out the window, how do we come back and design strategies for what might happen tomorrow? And putting pen to paper and thinking about those things, that's, I won't say easy, but that is certainly a process that we all can go through as we contemplate what our organizations might look like tomorrow. Any others, or maybe take one more comment or reflection?
Yeah, there's a couple of other questions in there. Take the next one in reference to, so nonprofit leaders are comfortable with adapting to the context and figuring out ways to make it work, right? In some sense, that's one of the many talents of the things that we require of nonprofit leaders, is to help get it done and figure out a way to get it done with what's available. So, I mean, how does this, maybe if there's a way to think about this as an opportunity, and related to this question is, how do you balance the need to be adaptable, right, with some sense of who you are as a core, or your core purpose of an organization?
Yeah, that's great perspective. And one of the things that I would say is that's why it's so important to go through a strategic process in terms of designing or thinking about what your organization looks like tomorrow. And one reason that's so important is because you may find out during that process that that's not for you, or who you are as a leader, or who you are as a person. So I've always admired folks that they grew their organization to a certain point, and it doesn't have to be in the midst of a crisis like this. More of the examples that I've seen is that if I'm the person that can take my organization to $2 million, maybe I'm not the person that can take my organization to $10 million. Or maybe that's the goal that I set for myself. And when I got there, I needed to personally rethink things. So it goes back to that reflection piece. And how do you balance that? We all have an obligation to the missions that we serve, of course. So going through that process, even if that doesn't mean that that's who we are personally, is an important step that I would say is vital for any mission of any organization, one, to go through the process again, because you have the responsibility to, and two, from personal reflection, to figure out if that's even you, what type of leaders would need to be identified, what type of work needs to be done when we start thinking about how our organizations potentially change. And we usually, when we talk about missions of organizations, I mean, we've had organizations that have been around for hundreds of years, 50 years, 60 years, and our missions tend to stay the same. But one of the points that we'll make when we get back to, again, just a few slides later, when we talk about, implications of organizations, the shift that we've seen, again, at least in this market, is that there's a shift towards basic needs. And we know that those things that may seem like, I won't say luxuries, but we know that some of our other organizations, whether they be the arts organizations, museums, theaters, some of those organizations will have real trouble in terms of staying afloat. So how can those organizations envision themselves in terms of maybe a new mission, maybe an integration with another organization? Now, these aren't things that I'm advocating for, but what I'm saying is, in operating in a pandemic, what we've tend to see is that organizations have shifted more towards, or folks need basic services. So we've seen donors that have shifted their donations towards basic needs. And we've also seen those organizations become more busy in terms of the services and the folks in need that actually need their provisions. Maybe what I'll do is I'll just pop through these next couple of slides and we'll get a little bit further into our conversation. So earlier we talked about the don'ts. So these performance tasks would be considered what you should do, or things to consider in terms of performance tasks and responsibilities that we have as leaders. So we start with early recognition. So this really took us by storm. All crises are different, but there's still one basic question. What could have reasonably, in your role as a leader, been foreseen? And again, not so much in relation to our current situation, but generally across the board in any crisis environment, as a leader, the one responsible for an organization's strategy being future-oriented, what could have reasonably been foreseen? And did you have that in mind? Making sense of things. So how you process information. So what do you go through in terms of how you process information? Are you doing it on your own? Are you engaging others? Are you looking at literature? What is your process for doing that and making sense of the things that are going on at your organizations, those changes? Again, down to critical decision making. So we talked about that flexibility a little earlier, that though you have to play in both zones where you would normally rely on your management team to be responsible for organizing work, directing staff, hands-on implementation, we still have to have that flexibility where we stay engaged at the highest level of our operations in terms of strategy. And then orchestration, were you able to employ persuasion when needed? And so what this article talked about was really having some balance there, but the orchestration really in relation to, were you able to persuade others in terms of partnerships that needed to take place in terms of operating in an environment like this? The other, on the far end of the continuum, was command and control. So we know that we can't operate like that, especially when we talk about external relationships, but somewhere in between persuasion and command and control, and saying, even with what's going on at our organizations and our communities, yes, we have an internal role, but what is our external role in terms of employing persuasion to get things done, and how you're seen in terms of operating with other organizations? And then contemplating what are those core functions at your organizations that need to remain intact for your organization to thrive or just to sustain through an environment like this. I like this one, and that was providing authentic hope. So at our organizations, again, sticking your chest out, how proud you are to be in the situation that you're in terms of, regardless of what's going on in relation to the crisis, that our folks know internally and externally that we're doing all that we needed to do to get us back to a normal state. The communication piece, we've talked about that one quite a bit, but what I'll go to, we've had a great example within the Bush School ourselves, throughout the university, Texas A&M, of how the communication has went up. So folks that you work with, folks that you lead, have they felt the difference of crisis communication? The consistency, the messaging, the saying it twice, key points that needed to be raised, not once, but twice, maybe 3 times. There should be a pure difference of what folks experience from you in terms of your regular communication to communication during a crisis. And just have to say kudos to our leadership at the Bush School, our dean, our department head. The amount of communications has really kept us attuned with the shift that we've had to make. And that's just one example. I know there's many others, but the point here is that there should be a difference that people can feel. And if things feel normal, that would go back to what you shouldn't do as a leader in a situation or environment like this. We'll go back to the reason why I said I liked providing authentic hope is because when we go back to the constructs of being authentic leaders, we go back to the concept of being transparent. So when we talk about rendering accountability, we have to ask those questions, or within our communications, make sure that we communicate, this worked, this didn't work. Here's what happened when this first started. Here's what's happening now. That type of accountability as a leader, good or bad. In this case, what the literature referred to is trying to avoid blame is where we do not want to be as a leader. So again, transparency around accountability with you in that position, what worked, what didn't, what happened before, after, and currently. And again, just going back to learning in terms of that reflection piece, this is not just for this crisis leadership presentation today. Over the years has been fairly consistent that leaders taking time out to reflect on what's going on in a certain situation in our environments without a crisis, in our environment without a pandemic, is how are we reflecting? How much time do we actually spend doing so to make sure that we learn and that we become more self-aware as leaders? And then again, just to end on in terms of these performance tasks, there were 10 of them, 5 on these each past following slides, is, we've talked about this with many organizations. What type of risk management plan do you have in place? Going forward, will you engage in preparatory practices after this is over? And I think all of us should really reflect on that from the standpoint of, are we doing this just because that happens to be the environment that we operate in now? I know not all, but many organizations that we've had the opportunity to work with do not have risk management plans in place. It's like you do them when they come up. So one of the things in terms of crisis leadership and how we can look at our own performance, how we can challenge others at our organizations that we work with is, once we get past this, is this a practice that we will continue to have or we reflect on things that could happen. And a big thing with these risk management plans and these preparatory practices, my guess is, because we've seen some of it already, is our funders, our foundations, those organizations will start to ask more questions around what do you have going on internally in terms of if something like this were to ever happen again, and how are we as individual leaders prepared, and how are we preparing our organizations on a go-forward basis. Okay, so I think we spoke about some of these, but the reality is, I mean, after going through all of this, I mean, this pandemic that's upon us, I mean, there's lots of other factors that affect the outcome of a crisis. But the reality is leadership through processes and times like this does matter. I mean, these other factors, was it something that was predictable? What is the size of the emergency? We've had Hurricane Katrina, we've had tsunamis, we've had hurricanes here in the state, behavior of others. When you interact externally, how are folks treating you? Do they truly want a partner? There's things that we can't control, but the reality is, as leaders, we have to set our minds on that leading through times like this matters and makes a difference eventually. And to the point that was made a little earlier, that public leadership, especially, any of you all that know me know that I believe that this is the toughest work that anyone can do versus a for-profit environment. And not to say that that's not important work, but public leadership is already amazingly tough. And that to get through some of these times, we absolutely have to employ shared leadership practices. I mean, we can't do it all. And then the point that was raised a little earlier that we discussed in a few of our questions is consider what your mission or your service provisions look like tomorrow and in the future. And knowing that in this environment that we've had a shift towards basic needs, is there something that we need to look at in relation to our missions at our organizations? What shifts are potential to our organizations holistically? That's not a question that we have to ask ourselves too often, but maybe that's something to think about as we go forward in this environment. We're going to do questions and answers now. There's some information about how to contact us, and know, as we mentioned, that we'll get this presentation as well as the resource that I use for this presentation. So thank you. And maybe we should open it up. I think Dr. Brown will continue to help facilitate maybe some of the questions, input, or responses that anyone has.
I'm just going to give a little bit of room for folks who kind of reflect. You gave a lot of material there, Kenny, and I think I'd be curious to hear some reaction before I start jumping in with stuff. You can unmute yourself. We got quite a few people in the room, but we haven't got a lot going on. Or feel free to type it through, and I can grab it that way as well.
Yeah, or feel free to just jump in with the comment if anyone has one.
Yep.
Hey, Dr. Taylor, this is Adam Eaton. Appreciate the presentation. One of the, I guess, I don't know if it's correct to try and look for, silver linings during a time like this because of everything that's going on, and it seems kind of disingenuous sometimes. But one of the benefits that I've seen from this is that, from my perspective, for me personally, I'm aspiring to be eventually a leader in the public sphere, and this has really given me an opportunity to glean some lessons learned from how my superiors and the leadership in my particular organization are handling things, and not just strategic planning or mitigation planning, but just even from the communication standpoint. And being on the I guess the underling side, knowing the difference between a gripe and a legitimate complaint or a legitimate concern. It's easy for those at the bottom or those of us who receive the orders to question everything and to complain and to say you should have done it this way, should have done it this way. But having that ability to really step back and evaluate the decisions that are being made and to reflect on those, and then to say to yourself, what could I do in this situation if I were in that position of leadership? And it's a really unique opportunity for leadership development, leadership skills development, and personal growth, because this is let's hope it's a once in a lifetime event, but this is a truly unique event, especially in the public sphere. And so it's a great way, again, to just step back and kind of glean some lessons learned from how not just the strategic planning, but also just the communications and how leaders are communicating to their employees, to alleviate fears. Those of us that have had to go into work, have had to continue to go into the office where they're starting to, when the first round of stay-at-home orders were coming in, how that was being communicated out. It's been a good opportunity for me personally.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. On one of our, you must have been listening in on one of our previous conversations. We had a whole dialogue about silver linings, and we should be thinking about what that is for us, because we will come out of this. And to your point, regardless of the seat that you sit in terms of what's being directed towards you, I know that we've talked about this some, is that what you can learn in terms of how you build what leader you're trying to become. That's many of the things that I reflect on today, is things that I would do different next time. Things that I know that I will never do based on things that were directed to me personally. So if we want to talk about, a silver lining personally, keep that with you, because all of that will help develop you for the role that's sitting out there for you next. Organizations that cannot rebrand, redevelop, come up with new services, consider a new mission. We know that there will be plenty of opportunities out there for folks once we get past this, for those that are ready. I know that I've challenged some of my students around what does an organization, a nonprofit organization, look like tomorrow? Many of the responses that we receive or inquiries that we receive from organizations have to do with the use of technology. And when we did our survey here in the local Brazos Valley, we're not sure that how that would aggregate across the state of Texas or anything. But one of the things that organizations came back and said is that you can help us with technology now that we've had to shift to this environment. So there are several silver linings. It's just going to depend on your perspective. Thank you for your comment, Adam.
Kenny, there's one in the chat box asking about, how much of this is an opportunity perhaps to put in place some plans, or, what is it that we can be thinking about in reference to planning, crisis management plans or procedures, things that we might, and I think it does, even I was chatting with someone the other day that it's sometimes opportunities that this is an interesting opportunity to begin to think about planning. But so just your reaction to what kind of plans, when might people engage in planning? Both topics and timing.
Yeah, so I guess to one of the points that was made just a little earlier is, I think, again, as public service and nonprofit organizations, we tend to think about risk as they arise, basically. So planning for the way that I've done it in the past is, as you hear from your peers of things that they've experienced in their communities. As over in the city of Austin, one of the things that we had to plan for in terms of when I was with Big Brothers Big Sisters is what type of risk management plan we had in place for pandemic flu at the time. Now, this was, I think, approximately 15 to 20 years ago, but again, was something that even though it wasn't anything that was upon us at the time, it was something that we needed to incorporate into our risk management plan. So what I would say is that we take this time as an opportunity to incorporate what that looks like for the next cycle. I mean, we've already heard that there's potential for COVID to be back hard and heavy, whether it be in the fall or the winter or next year. So now that we're getting through what's going on now, if we did not have a plan for it, the shift to an online environment, the shift to the services that we're making, it's always a good time for planning is the way that I would respond to that. And I think that this deepens our timing to move forward instead of just thinking about versus going ahead and putting pen to paper.
So there's another question sort of looking ahead, as things either pick up or, as you mentioned, potentially shift in ways. How do we come back, right? So people maybe are doing things in new ways. People are working at home. There's all kinds of stuff that we're going to be doing. How do we begin to transition back into maybe a little bit more of a regular pattern, or a pattern that we can carry on with for a longer period of time? Some of us are operating in ways that are, at 110%. So some thoughts about trying to regain some normalcy, perhaps, in our work patterns, in our work.
A bit unsure on that one, honestly. It really seems like I'm no expert in what's going on, that's for sure. But what I think this is an indication of is that our work has kind of shifted for good. And so I think we set our minds on that this is somewhat normal. We know how to go back and operate how we normally did. And what we need to be thinking about on a go-forward basis, again, from a leader perspective, is what we need to be doing to make sure that we can fine tune. I mean, personally, all of us, me personally, how do I personally get used to this environment that we're operating in? Timing is off. Communication is a little off. I believe we've been doing a great job internally. We certainly have, from our leadership, but there certainly is a disconnect. I've talked to colleagues across the university, and everyone's talking about how much time they have for this project that they didn't have the opportunity to get to because of working from home. So everybody is off just a bit. And I think what we're going to have to focus our time on is, how do we focus on making this environment right versus what we already know? Because the new norm seems to be where we're at now. And I think we would have an easy adjustment going backwards. But even more importantly, what I would have to go to is how the public, how donors will think about us from this point forward. How did we grow? How did we enhance our technology skills? Have we simply gotten used to operating in an environment like this? How did you keep your services going in a time like this? So I think those are the questions going forward. And again, anything backwards, I think we know that already.
It's nice. So reflecting on what we're learning or how we're changing in some ways is an interesting thought on some of that. Some folks are asking for examples of planning documents. We'll kind of dig those up and see if we can find some stuff. So we've got several folks from the center that are on here. Another comment about engaging staff. Maybe just talk a little bit about that a little bit more and think a little bit about some of the thoughts. I'm sure that's an issue for folks about, or different constituencies. I know I'll be talking about boards next week, but maybe even just a little bit of thought about how you might engage your board of directors and the communication practices that may need to happen there.
Yeah, so one thing that I would go through,
Lose them?
I'm still here. Were you talking about something? So one thing I wanted to mention real quick is when we think about our risk management plans, one source that we have for that, even though we'll see what we can dig up and add to our resource page, is to think about your insurance providers and the perspective that your insurers can provide you as well. So sometimes they can help organizations think through your risk management plans. Do you need to increase coverage? Are there new types of coverages that you need? Those can always be incorporated into the start of or a shell for a risk management plan. So how you balance that with your insurance providers, they can be a great place to start. And again, we'll also provide what resources we can. Without getting into too many details, I'll just go straight to some of the leadership theory in terms of how do we engage others. The one thing to me that sticks out in terms of the literature that I tend to look at has to do with how we truly engage others in decisions that we need to make. So as a leader in your dialogue, say with your board of directors, are you holding that information? Is that information that you've shared with your staff? Do you let your staff inform you before you prepare, say, for a board meeting, so that you can truly represent your most, vital human resource, that being your staff at our organizations that are helping to keep things afloat. So just in terms of, are we consistently letting folks know what we're thinking about, getting their opinions, and then taking that information on or upwards in our organizations as we think through things? So to me, a thing that makes a difference, and again, that we've seen in the literature in terms of communication, make sure it's consistent. Have a day or 2 days that you let your folks know, because of your consistency, that I should expect an email today with an update as to what's going on. The other is you can train your folks to be ready for incorporating their thoughts into questions that you have about decisions that need to be made. And just as sure as you do that, I mean, because I think that's just one of those things where things are moving so fast. Again, our work is urgent one way or the other because of the services that we provide. So especially in this environment, if we catch ourselves moving too fast, not having time for getting others' input, I would say that that's a mistake. I would say that we need to find time to, especially for those that are helping us hold up and deliver our mission and services, to let them know that what they think is important, and that's a way to groom. So I'll go back to those 2 points when I first started in terms of what should come from leadership. Are you developing others? And is that leading to organizational performance? And so engaging folks in decision-making processes, that's one that can definitely go toward developing others.
Thank you, sir. Probably got time for one more if somebody wants to throw one out there. As I mentioned, next week I'll doing a session on boards, and I cheated a little bit. I've called in the backup to help me out. I've asked our own Royce Hickman, who's on the session here with us right now. I know he's going to be joining us. I've always appreciated Royce's perspective, and I've also asked a colleague that I've worked with over many years, Judy Millison, who's over at the College of Charleston. So it'll be me and a couple of other folks. So I encourage you to invite others that may be interested, or hope you come back. Let's see if anything else came in here while I'm chatting. Any last words, Kenny, as we send folks back to their work? Thank you all for all your good work. I really appreciate all of you, and I continue to marvel at all that you do. So I'm honored to be able to be a part of helping your good work.
Same here. Just thank you guys for your support and for spending some time with us in this environment with as busy as you are. We appreciate it, and we're trying to do what we can to assist in any small way with these webinars that we're offering up. We feel like we're catching up to making sure that we help respond to what's going on in our community and throughout the state.
Thank you, and stay safe out there, folks.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.